Hello again. I dare say that viewers are aware of the fuss about some of the things held in museums, both in Britain and the United States, as well as many European countries. These are objects from Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world apart from Europe and North America, which have allegedly been stolen or looted by the forces of imperialism and colonialism, and should apparently be returned to their countries of origin as a matter of common justice. The problem is that things are seldom as simple as left-wing types tell us. I want to look at one particular instance of this very modern controversy and see what we can make of it. These are the so-called Benin Bronzes. They are bronze and brass works of art from the Kingdom of Benin, which is now in Nigeria. The thumbnail to this video shows a typical example of one of these. Most of these objects were seized in 1897 when the British Army raided the African coast following an attack on a peaceful trade mission to Benin. Benin was a city-state in Africa in medieval times and is sometimes cited as an example of an indigenous African civilization. Almost all the bronzes in the British Museum date from the 16th century or later. As part of a policy to place items in context, as they put it, following last year's Black Lives Matter riots, the British Museum has added some misleading information to the Benin Bronzes, which may be seen on their website. I give a link to this in the description to this video. Among other things, the museum have this to say. A further fundamental context that needs to be recognised for fully understanding this period of West African history is the transatlantic slave trade. This vast traffic in humans supplied labour to the colonies and plantations in the Americas, including those of Britain. While by the late 19th century this trade had been largely abolished, its increasing scale and barbarity in the preceding centuries had led to a massive impact on West African societies. Well, as it happens, the Benin Bronzes do have an intimate association with the trade in slaves, although not perhaps in the way that the British Museum might care to know about. The Benin Bronzes are mostly made not of bronze but of brass. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and brass an alloy of copper and zinc. Some of them are also alloys of copper and lead, which is useful because it makes it easier to date them. You can sometimes work out where and when bronze or brass items were produced by the different amounts of metals in them. So, for example, if there's lead in them, that can tell you something, or if there's 10% zinc or 5% tin, you can sometimes work out who was making them and when. Although it's often said that such bronzes date from as early as the 12th century, all those which have actually been examined closely are dated much later than this. 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, in fact. Some of the Benin Bronzes that the British seized were made as late as the 1800s. In other words, after the beginning of trade with Europe. This is very interesting. One way of dating the Benin Bronzes, which would be found in other museums, not just the British Museum, is by taking particles of clay embedded within the bronze and using a technique called thermoluminescence, and that can tell us roughly when the things were made. This has shown that none of the Benin Bronzes so far tested date from before the 16th century. Even more interesting is the tests carried out on the various alloys used, which can also date the metal. By determining the proportions of different metals used, it's possible to see where the alloys were being produced. The answer is, in almost all the tests, that the alloys they were made from were actually produced in Europe rather than Africa, and here's why. The Portuguese came to West Africa because they wanted slaves, and the African kingdoms were only too happy to oblige them and sell them slaves. So both parties were guilty here. The Europeans for buying the slave and the African kingdoms for selling them. The currency in West Africa at that time were bronze and brass bracelets, which were known as manillas. They were produced in Africa for a long time. The Portuguese realised that this is what the people in Africa wanted most of all. So they started producing in Europe these brass bracelets called manillas, and then taking them to Africa and using them to buy slaves. So between 1504 and 1507, the Portuguese traders imported 287,813 manillas from Portugal and used them in West Africa to buy slaves. So a cost of a slave might be something like 10 or 12 of these brass bracelets. The manillas that the Portuguese produced in Europe had a different composition to those being produced in Africa. The people in Benin then used that brass, melted it down, and cast their famous bronzes from them. This means that the Benin Bronzes in the British Museum are produced using European metallurgy in the first place, which is interesting. Secondly, it means that they're a product of the slave trade carried out by the Nigerians centuries ago. And I think it would be wrong to allow the descendants of those African slave traders to benefit from the wickedness of their ancestors. This makes the whole question of what is to happen to them very much more complicated than it first appears. They are made from European materials and also as much a product of the slave trade as any wealth in Britain today. Why should an African nation be allowed to benefit from that immoral trade in slaves? I'll be interested to know what the British Museum actually does with the things in the end.